Good evening, everyone. I'll just make sure that you can hear me. Can you give me a thumbs up, Carl? He's helping me out.
Yeah, I can hear and see you fine, Todd.
Very good. Excellent. So thanks very much for joining us. My name is Todd Haustein, and I'm a sustainability-focused engineer who's been working for Sustainable Living Tasmania for 14 years now. The first 9 as the CEO, and then the last 5 years I've been principal consultant, mainly focused on helping both governments and businesses to understand and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and their energy consumption. And with the money that we make from that consulting as a not-for-profit organisation, we put that into mission-focused community initiatives around Tasmania. A recent consulting job of mine was for the Tasmanian Planning Commission, helping them to write the State of the Environment report that was released just last week. My particular part was the air theme, so that was both greenhouse gas emissions, which we're talking about tonight, and also particulate matter pollution. Before we start, I'd like to pay my respects to the Muanina people, the traditional owners of the land upon which I am at the moment in southern Lutruwita, Tasmania. I'd like to pay respects to all First Nations peoples and their elders, past and present, and any First Nations people that we have here tonight. Welcome. Thank you. May we learn how to take care of the land as well as the First Nations peoples have in the past. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing if tonight, instead of the title being the poor state of Tasmania's emissions, if I could sit here and tell you honestly that we are doing a wonderful job of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately not the case, but you'll see this this image here is actually a Facebook post from about 6.5 years ago, when the data first came out showing that Tasmania had achieved carbon neutral status, meaning that we were removing just as much greenhouse gas from the atmosphere as we were putting into it. And I was one of the first people to celebrate that publicly with this post that came out the same day as the data, saying, congratulations, what an amazing milestone to have reached. There were some caveats in there because I'll actually go through those tonight when we get into the detail. So yes, as I said earlier, I was commissioned to help the Planning Commission with the State of the Environment report, and particularly I wrote the indicator report and the technical report on greenhouse gas emissions. The recommendations were written by the Planning Commission. There was a whole bunch of work done by other consultants, but those 2 reports in particular, I was the lead author on. And the condition that we gave Tasmania's emissions was poor, which might surprise some people because the narrative that we're used to hearing is that Tasmania is a global leader in reducing our emissions. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to talk you through the details and how we arrived at that conclusion. So the agenda for tonight, we've only got 53 minutes left. So I want to summarize the greenhouse gas emissions part of the State of the Environment report, give you some opportunity to ask questions, and I'll do my best to answer those. I'd also like to mention after that the Tasmanian government's draft plans on emissions reduction and resilience, and also perhaps have a quick discussion about what other things we can do. So launching into it, the data that was used for the State of the Environment report was all publicly available, all official data sources. So the main ones that I used were the Australian National Greenhouse Accounts, which gives you a state-by-state and territory and year-by-year emissions for all of the sectors and subsectors. There's actually quite a lot of detail there. We also used the safeguard mechanism facility data. So for any single facility that emits more than 25,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, they are required to publicly report their emissions through this safeguard mechanism. And so there's a few sites in Tasmania that fall under that condition. And so we can see where some of those emissions are coming from. I also used the United Nations Annex 1 national emissions data. So for all of about, 44 different countries that were industrialized in 1990 when the agreements began, they've all been reporting their emissions under a consistent framework that everyone follows every year. And so there's good comparable data there. The thing that data doesn't include is what we call scope 3. So in greenhouse gas emissions, we split things up into scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Scope 1 emissions are the ones that happen directly. So if you're driving a car, the emissions that come out of your tailpipe are scope 1 emissions. The scope 2 emissions are ones that happen from electricity, but it might not be where the emissions occur. So for example, if we use a whole bunch of electricity in Tasmania and we import some of that from Victoria, then some of those emissions that happen from generating electricity in Victoria will be Tasmania's scope 2 emissions. And then finally, there are scope 3 emissions, which are from everything else. And the graphic that you can see on the screen here, this is taken from the ACT's report on the ACT scope 3 emissions. They're one of the few places to actually have done the analysis to work out what those emissions are. And so the example they've given here is from a t-shirt. Obviously, to make a t-shirt, you need to grow cotton plants and cultivate them, harvest them, process them. You need to move things all around the world. You need to sew them, etc. And so with each of those steps along the way, emissions occur, but they might not happen in the place where the t-shirt ends up. And so in this example, it's being trucked into the ACT, and the only emissions that are counted in the national greenhouse accounts for the ACT is that last little leg of the Australia Post delivery vehicle driving it to the customer's end home. All of these other emissions back here are scope 3 emissions, and they're difficult to calculate, and they're generally left out, and we just focus on the scope 1 emissions. That same ACT report that I'm talking about did actually estimate the emissions from all of the states and territories. And so you can see Tasmania here. This first little bar here is the scope 1 emissions. The second little strip there are scope 2. And then this much larger bar here are the scope 3 emissions. So they're really significant emissions, and I think that we should be looking at them. It was one of my recommendations was for the Tasmanian government to commission research to calculate these emissions, because the work done here by the ACT was only approximate for Tasmania. So we don't really know exactly what those scope 3 emissions, how big they are. We're not sure what the breakdown is, how much of it's from t-shirts or computers or phones or whatever else. So I think that's some work that really needs to be done. But for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to focus actually mainly just on the scope 1 emissions, because that's what we have the data for, and that's what I'm showing you here. So these are the net emissions for Tasmania. You can see that they started up around 20 million tonnes per year, and they've wiggled their way down to now about -5 million tonnes per year. So since 2013, the emissions have actually been negative. We've been pulling more greenhouse emissions out of the atmosphere than we've been putting up into the atmosphere. So that is truly a wonderful thing. However, practically all of that reduction that you see over those years has been due to just one sector, and that's the forestry sector. So back in the 90s, we had a big native wood chip industry that was cutting down a whole lot of trees and chipping them and then shipping them off eventually for paper production. And that paper, that carbon ends up in the atmosphere quite quickly. So huge emissions back here. But then when the industry contracted and then eventually collapsed, we were left with all of those previously harvested forests now growing back and nowhere near as many forests being cut down. And so that's why we had these net negative emissions. But if we look at the emissions from everything else, we can see that it's been actually remarkably steady, if not increasing slightly, and it's higher now than it was back in the 1990s, which is well short of what scientists are telling us we desperately need to achieve, which is rapid and deep, and in most cases, immediate greenhouse gas emissions reductions in all sectors this decade. Now, if we zoom in a little bit, then we can see what the individual sectors have done. So this first line here is for agriculture. You can see that's been kicking up lately. Next, we've got stationary energy. So that's the energy that we use not just for electricity generation, but we also use some natural gas. And in industry, some coal is used particularly for cement and also some paper and pulp and paper production. Then we've got transport. So that's all the fossil fuel, the petrol and diesel that we use in our vehicles, and industrial processes. So these are things like with cement manufacture, for example, you crush the limestone and you actually got to extract the carbon and the oxygen out of that limestone to make cement. And so you're releasing that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So it's not from burning fossil fuels, but it's from releasing the carbon dioxide from the actual limestone itself. Similar process with aluminium production and also manganese. We use coking coal to remove the oxygen out of the ore. And so you can kind of purify the ore and get the metal that you want out of it. So you get these industrial process emissions. The next sector is waste. And you can see that's the only one that actually has come down since the 1990s. I think that reduction, in part, it's due to better measurement. You can see back here, it was just assumed to be flat. So we've had better measurement, but we've also had some waste reduction initiatives. Things like green waste collection have contributed a little bit, but probably a much bigger contributor has been the collection of landfill gas and the combustion of that gas, often to generate electricity. So that's used at McRoby's Gully, for example, the landfill in Hobart. It's also used at the landfill site in Copping, where a lot of waste from around the state goes, as well as landfills for Launceston and other major landfills around Tasmania. So that's the only one that's come down, but it's also the smallest one. So everything else has been either pretty constant or actually increasing. I've already mentioned a little bit about where those emissions come from. This kind of pie chart breaks it down a bit more. So I like to summarize it as cows, cars, coal, and cement. So cows, we've got a lot of cows and sheep also, they contribute in Tasmania, and they're part of their digestion process, they produce methane. So even though the carbon is balanced, like when the grass grows, a certain amount of carbon is pulled out of the atmosphere, cow eats it and it releases that carbon back into the atmosphere, but it releases it in a different form, not as carbon dioxide, but instead as methane. And methane as a gas is about 28 times more potent over 100 years on the greenhouse effect. So having a whole lot of cows and sheep means a whole lot of greenhouse gas emissions. Second sector is road vehicles. That's passenger vehicles. Private vehicles are a big chunk of that. Also commercial vehicles and trucks. The next two sectors, so they're industrial sectors. The cement and lime industry, these emissions, as I mentioned before, it's from the limestone itself, but it's also from the fossil fuels burnt to fire that process. And in the metals industry, I've already mentioned there, again, the coke and coal used as a reductant. Also some natural gas used for iron production. And for the last sector that I've pulled out, I've got a big other sector here that's kind of everything else. The other one is waste. So they're the main contributors to Tasmania's emissions. But the graph that I showed earlier was just the annual rate of emissions. So it's how much is being emitted each year. But what really matters, what actually drives changes in the climate is the total amount of greenhouse gas that we've put into the atmosphere. And that is building up over time. So instead of looking at just how much we've been putting out each year, what we should be looking at is the cumulative amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's what I've got here. It's split into those same categories. So agriculture, stationary energy, transport, industrial processes, and waste. And then this one stacked on top is the land use emissions, so mainly forestry. Certainly the lion's share, you can see it going up, 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 and then it's coming back down, but we haven't actually removed all of that carbon dioxide that were released from previously cutting those forests. We can see that a bit clearer just by looking at land use alone. So up, 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 flattens out, and then it comes back down after the collapse of the native wood chip industry, but we're still not back down to zero. We've still got a little way to go there. So it's important that we shouldn't be conceptualizing these removals of carbon dioxide as offsetting our current cars and coal and cows and cement, but instead we're undoing the emissions from forestry in the past. And in fact, if we could go back further in time, if that data were available, then we'd see that this is actually a much bigger mountain of emissions that we've only just started to come down the other side of it. I tried quite hard to get those more historical emissions, but unfortunately I couldn't get that. The data just isn't available. It would be possible for us to kind of reconstruct it, but that would require a fair bit of time and effort. It would certainly be interesting, but not sure it's the best use of our limited resources. But what we will see is that we will come down the other side of this as we regrow those forests over time. And so for many years to come, we should see these, a big chunk of negative emissions, maybe like 10 million tons of carbon dioxide per year being pulled back out of the atmosphere, which is enough to offset the emissions from everything else. But as I said, we shouldn't be thinking about it that way. We should really be thinking about it as undoing the damage that happened in the past, regrowing those forests that were cut. And we really need to do that. That's really important. But we also need to be reducing the emissions from everything else. That's crucial because those emissions are fundamentally different in that, it's easy enough to regrow a tree and to pull that carbon back out, but it's very, very difficult to pull the carbon back out from fossil fuel that it was stable under the ground for millions of years before we've pulled it out and burnt it and released it into the atmosphere. So that's not reversible in the same way. We got any questions so far, or should I keep going? No questions so far. So there is a Q&A feature. If you do want to ask a question, you should be able to find that in the Zoom interface there. And you can type your question in, and I've got Carl helping me, who will field the question and hopefully pass it on. But for now, I'll keep on rolling. So this next point is about the amount that humanity as a whole can emit into the atmosphere before we, really mess up the climate. We're already seeing climate impacts, and in fact, it may already be too late for us to stay below 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees. We could well reach tipping points just based on the amount of emissions that humanity has put into the atmosphere already. There is quite a large amount of uncertainty in the scientific modelling here. Not to say that the modeling's bad, just that there is uncertainty, and perhaps we could still emit quite a bit more and we'll be safe. But we're taking a big gamble. So what I've done here with the State of the Environment report was to take the IPCC's latest estimate of the global carbon budget. That's the total amount that we can emit, while still having a 2/3 chance, a 67% chance of remaining below a 1.5-degree increase over pre-industrial temperatures. So 1.5 degrees is broadly agreed that's relatively safe. 2 degrees, not so good, much bigger impacts. And so we would really like to stay below 1.5 degrees if possible. And so scientists estimated that we could release about, I think it was 500 million. Oh, sorry, I'm going to get the units wrong. It's an enormous number, but we emit an enormous amount. So if you take that global carbon budget and how much of it we've got left, then you can divide it by the global population. So that's like taking the pie and cutting it up evenly so everyone's got a slice. And then you can say, well, how much of that pie has Tasmania used so far? And it turns out that we've used 1.5 times our fair share of that pie. So we've already polished off our slice and we're now halfway through eating someone else's. Now, you might say, well, sure, that sounds bad, but isn't everyone doing badly here? Hasn't everyone already eaten their slice? And well, compared to other states and territories in Australia, Tasmania has actually been doing quite well. So these are our cumulative emissions since 1990, including land use and forestry and everything. And comparing it to the other states and territories. And you can see that we're second lowest after the ACT, and that's largely a result of them being a state that imports most of their electricity and their goods and services. So they don't have a heavy industry like Tasmania does. They don't have big coal-fired power stations like Victoria, etc. So their emissions are very low, but Tasmania's are second lowest and pretty comparable to South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales. But that's quite a low bar because Australia has exceptionally high emissions by international standards. And so the next thing I did was compare Tasmania's per capita emissions to other industrialized economies. And the data I went to here was the United Nations Annex 1 data. I can see a question there I'm just reading, which unfortunately I've already kind of skipped ahead, so I might just come back to that one later. Sorry. I'll just finish this point that I'm making first. So compared to other countries around the world, Tasmania is not doing so well. So we ranked 39th out of the 44 industrialized economies for which there were data. And so these countries are, they're the Annex 1 countries. So back when the international climate negotiations were first being held in the early 90s, they looked at which countries were already industrialized or well on the way to being industrialized, and they put them together in a group of industrialized countries and said, okay, this is one kind of country where you're industrialized, so your emissions are relatively high. We're going to have one set of rules for you. You have to start measuring your emissions and reporting them every year according to this agreed framework. For other countries, developing countries, they said, well, we're going to give you a little bit of leeway. You don't have the systems and processes set up for, to measure your emissions, but we're going to build your capacity and help you with that over time. But with the Annex 1 countries, we've got that consistently reported data with the same framework every year since 1990. So I was able to take that and work out their per capita emissions and then rank Tasmania against all of these other countries. So you can see Tasmania's emissions are actually quite high compared to some of these other countries. So I'm just going to tackle these questions now. There's two that I've got here. One from 80 is, what is the impact with the government's annulment to chop 40,000 additional hectares of native forests on emissions? That's not what I'm going to be able to do off the top of my head as a calculation, but I'd be interested to make that calculation. So what we do there is work out what's the tonnage on those 40,000 hectares, and we can work out what the additional emissions from that would be. But yeah, haven't got the numbers immediately at hand to be able to do that calculation. Maybe I can follow up on that one after the event. The second question there is, oh, actually, what I do have is this. So this is the harvest of Tasmania's forests over time. This is the dashed line here, is the harvest of Tasmania's forests. So you can see back in 2004, we were up around, what's that, 5.4 million tons of wood harvested. Can anyone type in how many tons per hectare there are? That's not a number that I've got immediately available to me, but yes, I should. Oops.
These are
I
exactly the
should
sort of things
just
that I
say that
used to
I'll make
calculate.
that calculation after the event, and hopefully I can get it out to everyone who registered. The second question from Mike. I've heard that a significant number of climate scientists think we are now likely to hit 2.8 degrees in Oz within 50 years. Do you have any thoughts on this claim? It's a really tough one to predict. I'm not a climate scientist myself. I have read a lot of the IPCC reports, but there are literally thousands of pages of those reports. I've probably only read a couple of hundred. I do know that there are quite large uncertainty bands, and so I would not be surprised if we hit 2.8 degrees within 50 years. That is completely within the realms of possibility, sure. Yeah, maybe if we get our act together globally, reduce our emissions, we can avoid that. But 2.8 sounds like it could well be reached, unfortunately. I just wanted to point out that with this was cumulative emissions since 1990. If you do the same calculation on just the most recent year of data, just looking at the gross emissions, so not looking at the amount being taken back out by forests, then Tasmania still ranks second amongst the states and territories and 39th out of the 44 industrialised economies. So it's not just a historical thing, it's also our current emissions, because as I showed before, they've barely budged from all those other sectors. So we're still not going so well there. Okay, Q&A. Have we got more questions from people?
Sure, Todd. I'll ask a question. You can hear me?
Yep.
Um,
Yes.
yeah, I'm just wondering if you think that the geography department of UTAS could help you do some modeling around the historical land use emissions way back to colonization. I feel like that's something that they could probably tackle with SLT as a partnership.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. I think it would be really interesting. Um, One stat that I did come across from the State of the Forest reports was that we now have 1/3 less area covered by forest than we did prior to colonisation. So it's like 1750 compared to now, there's about 1/3 less area of Tasmania forested. So you can imagine that the emissions from that would be quite enormous. That's not all forestry emissions. A lot of that is land use change, like clearing land for agriculture or for settlements. Whereas in recent decades, it has been purely forestry. But that certainly didn't start in the 90s. You know, we were making a lot of wood chips in the 80s and the 70s and prior as well. So it would be great to estimate those emissions. Got a question here from Mike. Hi, Todd. I work in the transport sector in Tas, state roads. Oh, half a question there. I'll wait for the rest, Mike.
As a continuation, Todd, I wonder what impact those historical emissions before we started really measuring in the 90s, what they have. Like just thinking about the huge land use changes as you were commenting on, that those emissions are still in the atmosphere, right, from 1950 and 1960. Why is it that they don't feature in the cumulative totals?
Sorry, why don't which emissions feature in the cumulative totals? The
The,
ones
the
prior to
pre-1990.
1990?
Yeah.
Yeah, just because we don't have the data. Like, so you got to choose a starting point and say this is cumulative emissions from whatever date you choose. And 1990 is quite arbitrary, really. That's just when the global community got its act together and said, we're going to start measuring this accurately and reporting it every year. But yeah, it is really quite arbitrary, and it would be much better to go back further. So the question from Mike was, any idea on improving? Are you asking there what we should be doing to improve, or are you asking, do we have actions in train that are going to lead to improvements? I'll come on to what the state government's planning in just a sec after the Q&A. But there don't really seem to be any signs so far. There are a lot of plans though, like some of those heavy industries are looking at, for example, using hydrogen as a reductant instead of coking coal, or also using inert electrodes that will release the oxygen directly, or as water vapor. I'm not 100% sure of the industrial chemical reactions, but they're looking at using inert electrodes rather than making them out of coke where they get burnt up and carbon dioxide released. They can use an inert electrode. And so there's that research and development is happening at Bell Bay Aluminium, for example. So there are plans to reduce these emissions. We've also obviously got electrification. That is one of the big broad themes of emissions reduction globally. When we electrify, we switch away from, for example, gas to electricity. There's a big efficiency gain. So in most processes, when we burn gas, it's not particularly efficient. When we use electricity instead, we can use much less energy. So we see that in both heating, for example. You can have a gas heater and burn gas to make heat, or you can use a heat pump. The heat pump is perhaps 300% more efficient than the gas heater. So already using a lot less energy. And obviously you can generate that electricity from renewable sources, avoiding those emissions. Another electrification thing, of course, is vehicles. So moving from fossil, diesel and petrol powered vehicles to electric vehicles, that is underway. Australia's been slow off the mark, but it does look like it's starting to ramp up pretty quickly now. That'll be interesting to see how quickly that can happen. But Tasmania is quite slow at turning over its fleet. So we tend to hold onto our cars longer. And there's a real risk that as the rest of Australia or even the rest of the world changes their vehicles over to electric vehicles, they dump their higher emissions vehicles on us. And so that's a real challenge. It looks like even if we stopped selling fossil fuel vehicles today in Tasmania, if we just replace them at the natural rate that Tasmanians tend to replace their cars, I think the stat was it'd take longer than 2050 to actually turn everything over. So that's going to be a slower transition, but it's at least starting and hopefully accelerating. And that's something that the government can help to accelerate. Mike has a question. Do you know what local government areas in Australia are leading the way to mitigate and adapt for climate change? I'd like to use their stories to help my own council. Yes. Hobart today released their climate plan. I'm going to skip forward to those slides now. 2040 Climate Ready strategy. This is actually a fantastic strategy. They did a huge community engagement process. Over 1,084 face-to-face conversations. They held this really cool thing called a climate assembly. Have a closer look at that. I won't go into it now. But it's got some very ambitious targets. So we're talking about a community target of a 70% reduction in emissions by 2030, which is very soon, and net zero by, or not even net zero, just zero emissions by 2040. And for the council itself, it's even more rapid with a 75% reduction by 2030 and zero by 2035. So a very ambitious goal. Excuse me. It's also a very clearly laid out strategy. So it's saying, this is where we need to be, and they have specific measurable targets, saying 85% of waste diverted from landfill by 2030. 95% of organic waste out of being diverted to composting by 2030. So some really specific examples there, and aiming to achieve 100% or as close as possible of capturing the gas that comes off landfills. And then they've got listed what they're already doing, but more importantly, what they will do. So this is not just we're going to think about it. These are things that they're actually going to do, and they're really quite concrete actions there. So I'm really quite excited by that plan, especially when you get to what the council is going to do itself about its own emissions. It's a little bit more difficult for a council to tackle its whole community's emissions. There's obviously some things that they can do in shared responsibility with the community, with businesses and so on, and Hobart's really looking at all of those things. When it comes to what the council itself can do with its operations, Hobart has some really solid targets there. So phase out fossil fuels. It's not beating around the bush. It's saying this is what we're going to do. And that 2026 date, I'm not sure if that is like completing the process or having the plan in place, but yeah, they're certainly looking to rapidly phase out, cease purchasing new fossil fuel powered assets for new buildings, upgrades, and other structures. So they're just going to stop buying fossil fuel infrastructure. These are the kind of actions that we need, not just at council levels, but also at the state level. So yeah, have a closer look at that plan. It's really exciting. So that was Mike's answer. Steve. Who needs to hear this information to make a difference to policy and practices? Always a very important question. I feel like when Tasmania kind of stumbled into being carbon neutral, I mean, it was basically from smashing the forest for decades and then the forest industry collapsing, or the native wood chip industry collapsing. And that was accidental. It wasn't a planned thing. And then the data came out and it's like, oh my gosh, we're carbon neutral. To begin with, I was kind of excited. I was happy to celebrate it. I thought maybe a little bit of good news for a change could lift people out of their despair and go, well, maybe we can do it, and get people excited. But it seems like over the last 6 years, rather than that being the case, it's more been that our elected officials in particular are able to kind of rest on that achievement, or that stumbling upon, and say, oh, look, Tasmania is a leader, we're net zero, and then not invest all that much in taking further action. So we do have some skilled people within the Tasmanian government, the bureaucrats involved. For example, at the Tasmanian Climate Change Office, I really appreciate what the effort that they put in and what they're trying to do. They don't have sufficient resources to really, for Tasmania to respond in the way that this climate emergency demands. So I think our elected representatives need to hear that's the information. And I think in order for them to hear it, we need to, more of the Tasmanian public needs to understand that Tasmania is not doing an amazing job of reducing our emissions, because forests and hydro, we can't just rest on those two things. We're actually failing to reduce our emissions from all of the things that matter, and we really need to do much, much more. So yeah, please help spread that word. Okay, we've got a few more questions here. Hi, Todd, great work. Were you going to talk about the ERRPs? We're working on recommendations and integrating your data from the SOA, the State of the Environment Report. Very too many acronyms. Actually, what are the ERRPs?
Emissions reduction and resilience plans.
Yes, that's the next thing on my presentation, so I will talk about that. Should we be recommending that state governments start reporting our Scope 3 emissions? It is shocking to think that we're responsible for so many emissions that we aren't tracking. Yes, I think we should. As I said, they're difficult to calculate. The way it's done is using big economic models. So it's it's averages, it's all a bit rough, but I don't think that's a reason to not do it. I think getting a sense for how much emission we import from the rest of the world and how much we export to the world, it will give us important information about, what we should do about it. And it's not a huge price tag to do that work. So yes, I think we should definitely do that. I'll talk about I've got about 15 minutes left, so we'll definitely come on to the emissions reduction and resilience plans, the ERRPs, soon. A comment from Catherine, not a question, but just saying that Dr. Jen Sanger's report on forestry and carbon emissions is probably the most up-to-date and relevant report in terms of current forest emissions and consequences of current forest practices. Yes, I talked quite a bit with Jen in preparing the State of the Environment report. I also spoke with people in Forestry Tasmania, the people in Canberra who put together the land use modelling, and a bunch of other folk. It's a big, complicated sector. And the folk at UTAS as well, who are doing that research, they showed me some interesting analysis that I think the important thing that we may have missed in Jen's report is the substitution effect. So if we're going to build buildings, then we're going to build them out of something. If we build them out of cement and steel, that has much higher emissions than if we build them out of wood. And we can grow that wood back. It's a renewable resource. There are reasons to use forest products. That doesn't mean that we should, wholesale wood chip the heck out of them like we have in the past. That's obviously a bad way to go. But I don't think it's necessarily quite as simple. And I think that it would be great to support an industry in Tasmania where we do have like engineered timber products. I'm not sure I'm actually saying anything that Jen would disagree with here. I don't think she's completely anti-forest products at all. I think she was just focused on showing that there are really significant emissions from the forest industry. We also can't rely on the forest industry or the regrowth of those forests to continue to be a net sink because of the risk of bushfire, right? That's a really significant risk. So even the people in Forestry Tasmania and the government more generally are a bit nervous about how dependent they are on those land use emissions or removals of the forests growing back. I hope I've answered that question. Another one from John Todd. The official figures suggest that the transport emissions per vehicle in Tasmania have roughly halved since 1990. I doubt that this would pass the pub test. Are we being fed incorrect data? I'm not sure which official figures you mean there, John. I'd be interested to hear because I used to look quite closely at the ABS published transport, or what was it called? Vehicle usage statistics, which gave all kinds of interesting data about, how many kilometers vehicles traveled of different kinds, and fuel consumption and fuel economy and a whole bunch of other things that was really interesting and useful information. That was dropped by the ABS and taken up by, what are they called again? It's not ABARE, but I'm forgetting. Anyhow, another government department, and they're doing a much reduced kind of survey and not publishing nearly as many statistics. So that's not nearly as useful. But I think that the way that at least the national greenhouse accounts are calculated is based on fuel sales. So they're not they're not going up, here's the per vehicle emissions and multiplying it by the number of vehicles. That would be a much rougher way of doing it. I think they're starting with how much fuel Tasmania imports, and basing the emissions calculations off that. So maybe these official figures about the transport emissions per vehicle are not right. I'd like to see them, but I think that the total number for transport emissions is probably more accurate. Given carbon emissions are more of an estimate, what would be the margin of error in such calculations? Tough question. Let me try and bring up. I've got so much data here to look at. I can show you a chart here though that is quite telling. So in the land use sector, no, hang on.
It's like the Matrix, Todd.
Yeah, there's a lot of data here. So each year, the land use emissions are calculated not just for that year, but they're recalculated for all the previous years. And that's because they're always updating and improving the models. I've just got to find the sheet that I have these emissions on. Here we go. I'll zoom in on this a bit. So these are the land use emissions that have been calculated for Tasmania, and the thickest black line there is the most recent estimate. And then as you get to the thinner, lighter coloured lines, that's going back each year. And so you can see that they've changed quite significantly. This graph here, which isn't displaying very well, hang on. This graph here are the cumulative emissions. So you can see there was this big jump from, was it 2019 down to 2020? And that's when we moved from a more approximate calculation method to actually looking at grid images to calculate or to estimate land use change. And so that is definitely becoming more accurate. But I couldn't put my hand on my heart and say I trust these numbers exactly because, I mean, they keep moving. The fact that they keep moving means that we obviously haven't got them accurate yet. And there are a lot of assumptions that are built into those models. So I think it's even hard to put an estimate on what the error of margin would be, at least for those land use emissions estimates. For other things, it's much easier to calculate. Like we know we can track really accurately how many litres of fuel we import into Tasmania. And we know that when you burn it, it releases a certain amount of carbon dioxide. The amount of some of the other greenhouse gases does change a little bit depending on how efficient the combustion is, whether catalytic converters are used and whatnot. But the margin of error is much smaller there. So it's easier for the technical, the technosphere. But when you get into the biosphere, into living systems like forests or also agriculture, how much does a cow burp? That has been studied. They put masks on cows and actually catch the methane that comes off them, and they measure that. And they've built up a model saying, if you feed them this and they grow at this rate, and they've done all those calculations. But when it comes to estimating the national greenhouse emissions, all they do is they count the number of, female dairy herd of a certain age, and by different ages, by the sex, and by whether it's dairy or beef production, and then they multiply that by a constant. And it's based on all of these previous studies, which are pretty well grounded, but things could change in the meantime. If the feed changes, for example, that would change the emissions. Even the breed could also make a difference. So yeah, there is uncertainty, but Australia generally has the more solid methodology. It has quite a solid methodology for estimating our greenhouse emissions compared to other countries. I think we're actually doing a pretty good job of that. Okay, running out of time, so I might skip ahead to the emissions reduction and resilience plans. So this is a state government initiative where they're creating a plan for each of those emission sectors. There are 6 in total, the same sectors that I showed you on the graph before, but they've already done 2 of them last year. They've recently released, this month, they released another 4. So energy, industrial processes, agriculture, and land use change and forestry. They're open as a draft plan at the moment, and they're open for consultation. The consultation closes quite soon, the 7th of October for these 2 and the 11th for these 2. And I would strongly recommend putting in a submission. It doesn't have to be, extremely well researched and technically thorough or anything like that. You don't even need to directly respond to the specific questions they've asked. You can just kind of skip that and just say, this is what I think. I think just prompting them to take stronger, faster action would be a useful thing. because the people who receive that feedback, that it is read and it's listened to and it is fed back to decision makers. So I think it's really important that we raise our voices and say we want more to happen. Now, I do have here examples. Where have I got that? Here we go. So this is the draft plan for industrial processes, for example, and there are a list of, not of actions, but of opportunities, things that could be done. And as I was preparing for this talk today, I was almost ready to be quite strongly critical of the draft plans, because you can see from these dot point, not actions, but opportunities, there's not a lot of doing. It's considering mechanisms, exploring funding options, exploring ways to support, considering options to support, exploring options, collaborating with regulators to review, considering embedding climate change. So there's not an actual, a lot of actual doing. Same thing with the energy plan. Explore opportunities. Analyze the suitability of setting a renewable gas use target. So not we will set a target, but we'll analyze whether it's suitable or not to set a gas target. So if that's the way that the plans actually ended up, then I would be thoroughly disappointed. But just yesterday, and I only saw it today, the final transport plan was published. The draft transport plan looked just like those ones I've showed you, a lot of opportunities to explore the potential of maybe doing something one day. But the final plan does look a bit better in that there are, actual actions here. And I haven't had a chance to look into it because I literally only just saw it. It had been uploaded to the website about half an hour before the talk started. But there are actual doing actions, and they're called actions, not opportunities. So that does look like it's much better. But I think it's very important for everyone to get on to the government website and put in a submission and make it clear that we want stronger and faster action. I think that's it. What else can we do? Make submissions to the TasGov plans, as I've just said. Tell our elected representatives that we want greater action. Tell other Tasmanians that what you've heard, that we're a world leader, isn't exactly true. We're failing to reduce our emissions from all of the sectors that count, and we really need to do a lot more. Roll up your sleeves and do some of the work ourselves. If you're interested in that, if you've got both the time and the skills, get in contact. Just send me an email, climate@slt.org.au. I'd like to do some of that policy exploration and advocacy for stronger action. And some volunteer support for that would be fantastic. And just volunteer and or donate to any of the organisations that are working in this space. And there are a bunch of them in Tasmania. They all take slightly different approaches. They have different focuses. They all do important things. And, I won't be upset if you go and volunteer for the other 5 that I've got on the screen. I think that would be wonderful. Yeah. Thank you very much for your time and for coming along. I've got 2 more questions that I might just have time to sneak in before we have to finish up. One from Nick Tao. G'day, Nick. Hope you're well. If we are to increase our production of renewable energy in Tasmania, where might that be best used to reduce emissions? For example, electrification of our transport sector compared with exporting that electricity to the national grid. If we add in consideration of local, social, and economic benefit, might this change your answer? The organisation that's doing some really good work on this at the moment is Carbon Zero. Please go onto their website and check them out. I'm not sure if, so Jack Redpath is the main man behind that. I've been collaborating with him, and he's written a fantastic report that I helped to just proofread, which goes through how much extra renewable electricity Tasmania needs to generate in order to completely decarbonise our transport fleet, in order to decarbonise our heavy industry, and in order to meet the renewable energy export targets that the government has set. If either one or both of the new interstate connectors are built, and it is an incredibly large amount of new renewable electricity generation is required. Obviously, that needs to be done in a sensible and appropriate way. We shouldn't be building a big wind farm on the migratory path of endangered birds. But there are other places that we can put large-scale renewable energy infrastructure. There are also, we have a lot more potential for rooftop solar in Tasmania. It is the cheapest form of electricity generation now, and we need to make sure that that cost saving is available to people who can't afford that upfront cost. And I think that is a really important area for the Tasmanian government to step in. We do have those interest-free loans that the Tasmanian government is supplying, but for people on low incomes, that's still not an option. So I think we need to dig a bit deeper there and make sure that the people who are struggling in our community can also reap the benefits of rooftop solar. I hope that's answered your question, Nick. The questions are rolling in now. Feel free to leave the e-forum if you've got to go, but I might just keep going for a little bit longer and see if I can get through a few more questions. John, unfortunately, a lot of the actions are like motherhood. Yes, hopefully the actual final plan will include less motherhood statements and more action. If you have a look at the Hobart plan, that has some really solid actions. But as I say, when you're trying to affect emissions beyond your direct control, oh, I'm paused here, aren't I? Oh, there we go. If you're trying to affect emissions beyond your direct control, so not just the organisation of the Tasmanian government, but the broader community or industry, then you can't just. There are less options available to immediately increase emissions, and so some of those goals of working with or advocating to the national government to do something, or working in partnership with industry, sounds a bit more motherhoody, but sometimes it is actually the best that can be done, or at least an important action that needs to happen. John, Todd, thank you. Very good overview. Thanks, John. Another thank you. Would it ever be possible to get Scope 3 emissions calculated at a state level? Sounds just too complicated. Supply chains can run so deep. Yes, it is possible. The authors behind the ACT government Scope 3 emissions, I reached out to them and asked them, could you do this for Tasmania? What would it cost? They said, yes, absolutely. From memory, the price tag was like around the $80,000 mark. So that is definitely, definitely affordable. And I'd love to see the Tasmanian government commission that study. All right, I managed to get through all the questions, and it's only 8:01. So thank you all so much for joining me, and hope to see you all again soon. And next time, I hope that my report will be that Tasmania's emissions are now on their way down. And yeah, wouldn't that be great? All right, thanks everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Todd.